Hello and welcome. You're watching The Debate, and my name is Gisumi Shahmadi. Now, Kill the Bill protests continue all across the UK. While many of these demonstrations have ended in violence, there is still no sign of Parliament backing down on a controversial legislation known as the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill that could give law enforcement officers more powers to crack down on protests. In this edition of The Debate, we will be discussing why UK protesters oppose the police bill and how it has cleared its second reading in the House of Commons. But first, let's go to London and talk to Saeed Pourreza. Saeed.
Good evening, Gisu. Yes, this protest today happened across the country. Thousands of protesters took to the streets of London and Manchester, with cities such as Bradford, Bath, and Nottingham, among others, playing host to those protests. 18 arrests were made in Manchester city centre, where the protesters had blocked the tram service. And it's become a thing, really. These protests all begin peacefully up until the riot police arrive with their riot gear and their horses and dogs, and the protests descend into violence. And police, we have seen from the footage, have really been heavy-handed in their treatment of those demonstrators. Today's protests really follow another one that happened in Bristol, a place that's seen other protests as well over the past couple of weeks. 10 arrests were made there after the demonstration descended into violence as well after the police arrived. The police in Bristol have really come under fire for their treatment of the demonstrators and for an attack on a journalist named Matthew Dredge, who works for the Daily Mirror, has posted a video of himself coming under attack by the police, who were there with their batons and shields, even as he told them that he was a member of the media. As you say, the controversial policing bill is being debated on in Parliament. It'll have to clear another survive another vote in the House of Commons of the British Parliament. Then it'll move on to the House of Lords, and finally it'll have to get or gain royal assent before it is written into law. The government has supported the actions of the police. The Prime Minister has come out, Boris Johnson, calling what happened in Bristol as disgraceful. But the fact of the matter is that these protesters are out there to stay, and they're saying that they're going to continue doing what they have been doing, which is opposing this bill, forcing a rethinking of it all by the government. But we know that the fact that the government has a majority in Parliament will really give it a strong hand in getting this bill through the legislature and turning it into law. But the critics, among them politicians on the left, are saying that really what this bill does is curtail freedom of expression, of speech, like how noisy a protest can be, and things that go with it. And they're also saying that the day that this bill is written into law will be a day that the UK, as a democracy, will turn into a dictatorship, Kisu.
Thank you very much. That was our correspondent, Saeed Pourreza, joining us from London. And also we have investigative journalist Tony Gosling, who's joining us from Bristol. Now, Mr. Gosling, why was the police bill proposed in the first place? By the footage that we see, it seems that the police already have enough powers.
Well, funnily enough, parts of the bill, the police themselves said they didn't want. And it's a very good report by your journalist there. But one thing he missed out is there's a very, very important part of this, what is being called now here the police state bill, which is to do with trespass and criminalising trespass. That's one of the protests which the police were particularly violent at, even though the demonstrators in Bristol were sitting down with their hands in the air, with their hands up, The police still went in with the dogs, arrested 14 or so of them, many of, that's something like, 1 in 10 of the people 1 in 20 of the people who were there. So this is another aspect, and the timing is interesting, isn't it? because this is all being pushed through under a lockdown. And so the Mayor of Bristol, the Mayor of London, the police chiefs, etc., and Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, who I think is really the one main person behind the police violence, are saying, oh, well, you can't protest because of a lockdown. Well, you know, the 20,000 or so people in Bristol who are about to be criminalised by this bill, of course they are going to protest. They're not going to say, well, we'll wait until the lockdown's finished and then we will, because this is the crucial stage. We're going through just into the committee stage of the bill in Parliament, and at that point, this is the point where you need to make your voice heard, and you need to say to the police and to the media and to the general public and to the politicians, we're not going to stand for this bill. You know, there's a whole bunch of people been involved in this Kill the Bill protest movement, which is sprung up literally over the last month or so. But the thing is, this word "kill the bill," let me explain for your viewers. It sounds, I mean, the bill is the old bill in Cockney rhyming slang. It is what we use to refer to the police. So "kill the bill" has a connotation of killing the police. So that's why it's a bit of a cheeky word to use, but actually, of course, it's the bill they're referring to, this police state bill that they want to kill. Now, this was something that I was involved, actually, as a journalist and as a marcher back in 1994 in the Criminal Justice Act in Britain, which was the first step towards what they're trying to do to completely criminalise trespass in Britain, where they got rid of free parties. They brought in something called aggravated trespass, where the police would get more involved. Usually it's just up to the landowner to do something about it if someone turns up on their land. So there is an echo right back to the 1990s, and really what this bill is trying to do is to pick up on those the criminalisation of trespass that happened back then, and make it actually a permanent thing. In fact, it's very similar to the law in the United States, and quite a lot of what we do in Britain is they have criminal trespass laws in the US which are very similar. But we in Britain have had travelling people, itinerant people, squatters, etc., for thousands of years, since time immemorial, and this is the first time there's ever been an attempt in Britain to turn all those people into criminals. And that's why I think there's been such a move against the police, particularly demonstrations peaceful and some not so peaceful, to show the strength of feeling, to send a very clear message that they're not going to use a lockdown to stop a demonstration against this bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gosling. Let's also turn to journalist and commentator James Tweedy, who is with us from Plymouth. Mr. Tweedy, why is the British government pushing for this bill, despite the backlash, all these protests that we see all across the UK?
Well, I mean, there's more than one backlash, perhaps. I mean, if you're going to protest, you have to be careful that you don't alienate the majority, and by causing so much mess and inconvenience and damage to the cities where you're protesting, and that's what happened in Bristol to a large extent. They were smashing up people's private cars. And, my fellow guest here mentions the meaning of kill the bill. You know, I mean, it is essentially an advert to anarchists to come and have a fight with the police, which sometimes the police are quite happy to do, by the way. But these protests are they've kind of jumped the shark, and they're likely to alienate people. So it's a problem. The bill is, it like a lot of crime bills in Parliament, it contains a lot of very disparate elements, and some of those are new laws to prevent violent criminals and sex offenders and people convicted of terrorist offences too from being released halfway through their sentence on license, on parole, right? They're going to have to wait until 2/3 through their sentence, if this bill passes, to be released. And that's something that's actually very difficult for anyone on the government benches or in the opposition to argue against. In fact, the opposition have said that they agree with that, basically. And they abstained on the first vote against this bill. But, the second is, on the second one they voted against it. But because of what happened on Clapham Common a few days earlier, and that when the vigil for a woman who was murdered Sarah Everard, was broken up by the Metropolitan Police, the London Police. But what happened there was done under rules, special lockdown rules, which essentially make all large.
Well, actually, it's interesting that
illegal.
you pointed to that particular incident. Well, all of this comes at a time that it's in the wake of actually the murder of Sarah Everard, who was instantly murdered by a police officer on her way back home. And that would sound the alarm, one would think, for the parliamentarians, to be more cautious about the type of bill that they would bring into law. Or that doesn't seem to be the case, though, Mr. Tweedy, does it?
The bill was drafted long before that happened. It was drafted, it was this this debate's been going on for a year or two now, What happened there was that the Metropolitan Police went over the top, and the Metropolitan Police is the commissioner, the chief inspector of that police force is Cressida Dick, and Cressida Dick was in charge of the operation that back in 2007, which saw an innocent man killed. A Brazilian immigrant was apparently mistaken for British Bangladeshi, John Charles de Menezes, and he was killed, and then the police leaked stuff to the media, told lies about it. So this person, who was, by the way, promoted by members of the Labour Party, she was in charge. You see, and okay, so there are these rules that have been introduced during the lockdown against large public gatherings, and the police have been applying them selectively, and it's okay for the police to have that discretion, but on that occasion it was very obvious, they'd allowed a lot of very large and angry protests and marches and things to go ahead, and then this thing was a silent, static vigil in a park at night when there aren't a lot of people around, and they broke it up quite forcefully for some reason. I don't understand why they did that at all.
Well,
exactly, Mr. Gosling, I think you could comment on that, please.
That's right. We now know why. It's because the Guardian got a leaked memo from the Home Office explaining that it was directly Priti Patel herself that had written a memo to the Metropolitan Police asking for them, or in fact, she's not really asking, is she? She's telling them to shut this vigil down for Sarah Everard. I mean, she's a provocateur. Let's not forget that Priti Patel, back in 2017, was sacked for 12 illegal meetings with the Israeli government when she was the DFID secretary. That's the Foreign Aid Secretary, and she was sacked for those, including one of the things she was trying to do secretly when she said she was on a private holiday. She was secretly meeting with all these Israeli officials. One of the things she tried to do was to get British public money for the Israeli army in the Golan Heights. Now, she is a traitor for having those meetings, and she should never have been allowed back into government. And now she's actually managing to steal a march on Boris, really, by making him look stupid, and he hasn't got the guts to sack her. He should sack her right now for ordering the police into that vigil on Clapham Common. It's one of the most disgusting bits of policing we've ever seen in Britain, and it's no part of a democracy. This is police-state policing being done specifically by Priti Patel, and we've got the memo, we've got the evidence that it was her behind it.
And honestly, Mr. Gosling, it's very paradoxical for us outside the UK to see police violence in response to peaceful protesters that are concerned about exactly that. So what kind of message do you think this is sending the world?
Well, what we're seeing here is, I think, a real hiatus in British politics at the moment. It all depends on whether Boris has got the guts to sack the traitors within his own cabinet. But I don't think he has. I think he's a very weak Prime Minister. And what we'll see, I think, in the next few months is we're going to see more and more confrontations over this particular Act of Parliament. Just think how reckless and stupid it is of Priti Patel to be pushing a bill through which is going to make at least 20,000 people in Bristol, that is the people who have got their housing problems, that we're sort of homeless, people that cannot afford to either pay a mortgage or pay the rent. We've got something like 20,000 of them in Bristol, officially homeless. She's going to try and turn them all into criminals. The idea here, of course, is to turn the forces of government on the poor. And what's also been going on at the same time is complete impunity for criminals who are rich. Particularly, we're talking here about bankers. And in Bristol, we've got the Lloyds Bank, the business support unit, which has been accused accused by former police officers and by campaigners and people who've lost their property of fraud, very much like the Reading fraud that was also being done by Lloyds Bank several years ago, and people were prosecuted and jailed for. They're not being jailed in Bristol. So what we're seeing here is the machinery of criminal justice being turned from the criminals onto the most vulnerable in society. And I think that really is a recipe, if it's not stopped, for civil war in Britain.
And it is actually very interesting. Mr. Tweedy, the rules set out in the bill can be applied to a demonstration of just one person. What exactly does that mean?
Well, okay, I mean, maybe it can be yes, any kind of demonstration can be shut down, but actually we've had rules more or less to that effect for a long time now. It's been very difficult to organise protests in London. You have to get, outside Parliament, for instance, or outside 10 Downing Street, you have to get permission. I mean, in practice, they've gone ahead, for sure. It's been done, but you had to, these are rules that were introduced about 20 years ago, which, there are already restrictions on the right to protest. It's not unfettered. We could turn to other things. I mean, there's been a certain amount of controversy about the part of the bill which increases the penalties for vandalising public property, in particular monuments. Not other forms of public property, but monuments. There's a thing. I mean, why has that been written into this bill? Is because some middle-class white people who were attending a Black Lives Matter protest decided that it would be funny to graffiti a statue of Winston Churchill, and then there was other graffiti put on a statue of Gandhi and on the Senate hat on a war memorial. You see, so we have this thing where Britain is full of memorials to war memorials, and of course most of them commemorate at some point, or many of them commemorate the Second World War, which is the war against fascism, in which we were led by Winston Churchill, because that's the history of it. And there are other memorials to the volunteers who went to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side against the Phalangists and the Carlists, the fascists, basically. And these memorials are now, vandalising these memorials could get you 10 years in jail now.
Exactly, 10 years in jail. That's quite a penalty. Mr. Gosling, don't you think so?
Well, look, the main reason they're doing this is because of what happened last year at the Black Lives Matter protest in Bristol, where the statue of Edward Colston was pulled down and thrown into the docks. And there have been many of us, historians like myself, who have been calling for this statue to be put somewhere less prominent, maybe in a museum or something like that, for many years, and they've been ignored. Edward Colston was a slave trader, but his name is all over Bristol. Colston Hall, there's various other places, Colston Hill. So he is almost, there's Colston Tower. There's various places around Bristol commemorating this slave trader. And he is supposed to be some sort of great guy. Of course, he wasn't. He was making money from misery and racism, as many, of course, were in those times. And so I think it's absolutely right that there was some kind of challenge to this being a prominent person. And that's why they've done this. I think that's the only reason. Look, I think this is in a way a bit of a side issue, because this bill, what it will do is it will give the police discretion as to which demonstrations they close down. Of course, that demonstration I'm talking about last year wasn't closed down. There were just a handful of police around. If we get to the situation where the police can pick and choose who they like and who they don't like, if there's a particular, say, for example, an anti-police demonstration, they come in with the riot police. If it's Extinction Rebellion, they start dancing with the demonstrators. Then this is a police state. And that's what most people are objecting to when they say kill the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gosling. There's one final question. We really don't have that much time, so Mr. Tweedy, if you could please make it quick. Why do you think there is so much rush on voting on this bill? Why not give parliamentarians more time to scrutinize it?
I don't think it is being rushed. I mean, it's only just passed the second reading, and now it's in the House of Lords, and that will take a long time. They'll make amendments to it, and that will go back to Parliament. And the government doesn't want to accept those amendments, so there's going to be quite a long period of tennis where they.
So you do believe that there will be enough time to scrutinise the bill?
Yeah, there's plenty of time to scrutinise it. It's been published and people can read it. The question is, why did the Labour Party abstain on it in the first place and then vote against it the second time? It's just because of what happened on Clapham Common. It doesn't make a lot of sense. They're just playing the Labour Party is playing a political game. Firstly, their political game was not opposed.
Thank you very much. So,
Mr.
Gosling, just one final question, make it quick. Are you as optimistic as Mr. Tweedy? Do you think there will be enough time to make changes to this bill?
Well, there'll be many more demonstrations, and that's what we're going to be seeing, because we've got something like 1 million people, particularly, most of the arrests at these demonstrations have been basically young people between the ages of about 16, 18 and 22, 25. I've seen the figures of, the ages of people arrested in Bristol. We're talking here about the young people are scared about their future. They think that there is no future for them. There's no jobs. There's not the education they're getting is very poor, and so they're saying, if we cannot actually demonstrate against changes that we believe which are going to affect our future, then we are going to make some changes right now. And I think that the youngsters have decided that this bill is simply not going to go through, and they'll stop at almost nothing to make sure they send a very strong signal to our politicians that they are going to be there on the barricades, and we could even have a civil war, as I said. If you're going to make up to 1 million people who can't afford rent and mortgage, criminals, then of course you're going to have a serious problem on your hands, and I don't think the government really wants that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol, and journalist and commentator James Tweedy out of Plymouth. Thanks to both of you gentlemen for joining us on this edition of The Debate, and also thanks to all of our viewers for following us.